Good evening, I'm Scott Schaefer. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me now for our news panel are Jackson Vanderbecken, San Francisco Chronicle reporter, Aaron Glantz with the Center for Investigative Reporting, and Josh Richmond, Bay Area News Group political reporter. Well, tax revenues have been higher than expected, but the revised state budget that Governor Brown released this week has left many still grumbling. Education got a big boost of nearly $3 billion, but safety net programs for the poor and disabled were left behind.
Everybody wants to see more spending. That's what this place is. It's a big spending machine. You need something? Come here and see if you can get it. Well, but I'm the backstop at the end, and I'm going to keep this budget balanced as long as I'm around here.
And Josh Richmond, the legislative analyst, came out with some revenue projections that were actually $3 billion higher than the governor had anticipated or said he was anticipating. So why the differential, and what difference is that going to make as these budget talks begin?
Well, the $3 billion, it's important to note, is spread out over 3 budget years. It's not like the legislative analyst thinks there's suddenly $3 billion right now that there wasn't earlier in the week. The difference in estimates basically deals with how much economic growth they're forecasting over the next couple of years. Jerry Brown thinks that things might slow down a little bit, the growth might slow down a little bit, and also that the fact that we're now paying back our now full payroll tax rate means that personal growth isn't going to grow as fast. So he's got the more conservative number, the lower number. The legislative analyst is a little bit rosier. They say the stock market's taking off, things are starting to look a little bit better, but they caution they could be wrong, and now is not the time to start spending aimlessly.
You know, it's interesting. In the past, if you think about it, Schwarzenegger, Gray Davis, it was usually the governors who were overly optimistic about the revenue so that they could maybe soften the blow and put off some of the tough decisions. And yet this time it's the governor who's saying, no, things aren't as good as you think they are. Well, what's behind that?
Well, Jerry Brown has a decades-long reputation for being cheap. And I think that's very much why people elected him when they did, is that they didn't think he was going to go in there, despite the fact that he's a Democrat, and spend in a very conspicuous sort of way. He was able to deliver good news this week. You know, remember that the May revise is the updated forecast and plan. He rolls out his original proposal in January. Now we have the May revise. It starts the traditional budget season in Sacramento, where he and the legislature can now fight about it for a couple of weeks and then hopefully pass something.
And of course, the Democrats have 2/3 majorities in both. They were, kind of muted support. I mean, there was not a lot of cheering this week necessarily from them. Where does this leave them?
There was muted support from both sides of the aisle, actually, because Republicans know that it's a pretty conservative revenue estimate and that he's not restoring a lot of the cut funding from recent years. And of course, some of the Democrats are upset that he's not restoring some of the cut funding. And there's some fights over his local control funding formula for schools in terms of what and how money will be targeted to disadvantaged students and districts. That's something that he and Darrell Steinberg and the Senate will have to work out in the next couple of weeks. But generally, the overarching theme is, isn't it nice to be discussing how to spend this money we've got rather than discussing how to cut for the money we don't have?
Yeah.
Which is the first time in years that we've been able to have this discussion. And a lot of that is due to Prop 30, the measure that Jerry put on, Governor Brown put on last November's ballot to raise sales taxes and then income taxes on the wealthiest citizens. He's adamant that we don't festoon this budget with a whole lot of extra spending at this point and get us back into the hole we were in just a short while ago.
He's not going to go for any more taxes? Because I know the Democrats still want a oil severance tax.
Yes, and he was asked about that at the press conference right out of the gate. And he said in the past, he reiterated this week, that he doesn't want to discuss any more tax revenue increases at this point. Anything else that we do, he says, would have to go to the voters. He's not eager to put something else before the voters. In his words, I'm paraphrasing, we got a good tax. Let's spend it wisely and show that we can spend it wisely before we talk about trying to raise any other taxes.
What's the chance that the safety net cuts that have been going for a number of years now will ever be restored at this rate?
Well, ever's a long time. Darrell Steinberg and to some extent the John Perez and the Assembly Democrats would like to see some of those cuts restored post-haste. The governor says he'd love to, but until we know that we have the money going forward, we can't do that. There are some modest CalWorks spending increases in this, a few other places. Unfortunately, the courts, which have been suffering very badly, are not getting any more money now than they were projected to be getting in January, and the Chief Justice is very upset about that. So,
to what extent is there, any kind of gimmickry in this budget? I mean, other governors have been accused of that in the past, that there's they're borrowing money from this or that. I mean, are they not in this budget, for example, taking a little money from the cap and trade fund?
Exactly. That was one relatively small controversy. This budget borrows about $500 million from the fees that are being collected under the new cap and trade system as a one-year loan to the general fund. Sort of helps the books balance a little bit. But the caveat with that is that the loan can be repaid earlier if there's a need for that money from where it was actually supposed to be directed, which was to pollution abatement and climate change, clean energy projects and stuff in disadvantaged communities. So if there's actually a plan and a need for that money, the state could conceivably use some of this extra cash flow that it's had over the last couple of months and get it back a little
And then
fast.
just real quickly, a big issue for Jerry Brown has been the overcrowding in the prisons. Is there any new money in there for that?
Pitching a little bit more money out to the counties under the realignment plan. But he's doubled down on, he is still adamantly in favor of this. Basically, with the federal courts breathing over his shoulder to reduce prison population, there's not a lot of choice. So he's
Well, it sounds like he got
forward.
dinged by the Supreme Court, and he's still not really complying completely.
He's
Well-
going to file an appeal with them too, right?
Yes, exactly. That's a still progressing saga.
All
for
right.
us.
Josh Richmond, thank you so much. Well, a different kind of budget story now. For many veterans returning from war in Iraq and Afghanistan, other battles await them at home, from coping with trauma to finding work and affordable housing. In California, a state program to help veterans buy homes remains largely untapped. $1 billion remains untouched. Aaron Glantz, you've been reporting on this. What did you find? What is this program? Somewhat obscure, but they seem to have a lot of money, or at least money available.
Well, they have a lot of money because voters love it. It's this home loan program where veterans pay back the loans on the houses that they buy, and then they pay back the bonds with the interest on their loans. So the last time this went to the voters in 2008, $900 million, no organized campaign against it, passed with over 60% of the vote. Guess what? Of that $900 million, not 1 cent has actually gone to help a veteran buy a house. And the agency that distributes these loans, the California Department of Veterans Affairs, last year, even though they had over $1 billion in the kitty, as you mentioned, they were only able to distribute 83 loans. They spent more money administering their program than they actually made in loans.
So when you say not 1 penny of that money, so where did the money come from for the loans?
Well, they're still working off of this other bond measure, which passed overwhelmingly in 2000. So they had quite a bit of money left over from this 2000 bond measure, but in 2008 they said, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are still going on, we're going to need a lot more money. They went back to the voters, they got $900 million more, but in fact they're still working ever so slowly on this bond measure from 13 years ago.
I know CalVet, the agency, sent out a statement sort of urging a correction, saying that, hey, we didn't really, the money's not sitting there, we haven't sold the bonds, and there's declining demand for the loans anyway. What's your answer to that?
I mean,
is there a declining demand?
Well, in 1998, the legislative analyst said that they thought the program should be discontinued or phased out because there was even then declining demand. And at that point, they were making 1,600 loans a year. And last year, they made 83 loans. But it's not competitive with the private market, and it duplicates efforts that are done by the Federal Department of Veterans Affairs. So the agency said, hey, it's not like we're wasting taxpayer money. This money is just sitting there. We haven't even sold the bonds. But if you're a veteran and you are struggling and you know that there's this potential of $1 billion that the voters have already approved that is not being used, it's extremely frustrating.
Well, and not only buying a home, but you've got all these homeless veterans as
yes,
well.
So John Perez, the Speaker of the State Assembly, says, hey, since we have all this bonding authority that we're not even using, let's go back to the voters. Let's take $600 million, about half of the money that's just sitting there doing nothing, and get it reappropriated to build housing for homeless veterans. And Los Angeles is the #1 city in the country for homeless veterans, about 16,000 homeless veterans here in California. He says, let's actually use this money, to house some people.
And the money that's been spent, or the money that the cost of the program, like what's the money being used for?
Well, I mean, they have
Just
a call
staff
center
and-
in Sacramento. You know, they have employees that work on the second floor of a building downtown. I went there last week. They didn't seem to be doing very much. The phone didn't ring when I was touring the call center, but I was assured that they were usually very busy. They don't appear to spend any money marketing this program. Maybe if they did, people might find it useful. But it is set up in this very weird way because it was actually founded in 1921 when World War I veterans were having trouble buying homes. And it's a very odd program where the state actually owns your house. They have they own the land, and then you're like leasing it from the state until you pay it off, and so realtors hate it, and the interest rate is high. There's a lot of reasons why it's not really being used.
So this isn't necessarily a lack of awareness of the program, but the fact that the program both is not fulfilling the needs of people who can't actually buy homes anyway if they're homeless, or if they are buying a home, there are better deals for them out there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Like what's the interest rate, for example?
the interest rate, well, they just lowered it to 3.9%, which is somewhat competitive. But a year and a half ago, you know, when you can get a loan for 2.5% or 3%, they were at 5.5%. And you have to buy insurance from them. You know, there's a lot of things about it that kind of scare people off.
They're talking about revising it. How are they going to do that? What's the plan for their big revamp for this? What are they going to make it more attractive?
Well, I mean, they lowered. It sounded to me when I talked to them that their only real way to make it more attractive was to lower the interest rate, which is, of course, makes it more attractive, but it's still fundamentally, you know, not attractive as compared to the private sector and these government-backed loans. You know, you can buy a loan through the California Department of Veterans Affairs. You can buy a house with little or no money down if you have decent credit, which is great. But you can also do that with the federal VA through a traditional bank and get a lower interest rate.
And then just quickly, Aaron, I know you've done a lot of reporting on the backlog with the federal VA in terms of benefits and that kind of thing. Is there any relationship with this, or is this completely separate?
No, I mean, the amazing thing is I think this is one of the reasons why this money has gone unnoticed for so long is that most people don't even realize that California has its own Department of Veterans Affairs. Even most veterans don't know that. So, you know, here they are. They're fighting for their benefits with the federal VA. Meantime, the state has like socked this money away, you know, and is not even using it.
Yeah, and so even if there is going to be a change, they're going to have to go back to the voters for that, which could be
Probably in 2014.
2014. All right, Aaron, thanks very much. You can hear more, by the way, of Aaron's reporting on next week's California Report on KQED Public Radio. Well, with revelations surfacing nearly every week about unsafe rods on the new eastern span of the Bay Bridge, the legislature took action this week. Lawmakers grilled Caltrans officials about questionable materials and how they were chosen.
It's a bad batch of metal. These bolts were made in Illinois, is that correct?
Ohio.
Ohio, okay. So are you going after them for preparing or manufacturing a bad batch of metal?
We are working with our contractor.
Okay.
They are a supplier to our contractor on contractual requirements as we speak.
Okay, because again...
And Jackson Vanderbecken, we've got all these investigations now going on, lots of dust getting stirred up in Sacramento. Where are those investigations leading?
Well, they're basically leading back to Caltrans and how it was that they decided to put these particularly susceptible, vulnerable rods in the Bay Bridge in the first place. They are just, while they're very strong, the ironic thing is that because they're strong, they can be weak to the attack of nature or to just even rainwater. And what happened was with the first batch of 32 rods that failed, they left them in tubes that filled up with rainwater. And some experts believe that that rainwater was basically their doom because strength steel that's high strength has a coating. In this case, it's galvanization. It's a zinc coating. And if there's gaps in that coating, there's a chemical reaction that can be triggered that literally drives in toxic, arguably, hydrogen, which makes them weak and cracks them.
So they were mishandled, but were there also materials that were not up to standard?
Well, actually, the materials that they got were exactly the materials they ordered. It's just that these materials are by nature susceptible. So now they have a problem. They have 2,306 of these rods that are made to material specifications that they set. And there were warnings, there have been industry guidelines, essentially black box style warnings. Don't do this. It's not advisable to put this kind of high strength steel under high stress and galvanize it with zinc and stick it out in the open air because it can get brittle and crack.
And so how hard is it to, what has to be done to make sure it's safe?
Well, they need to check them to see if they're not too hard. That's when they're in the process of doing that.
Didn't some of them already snap, or was that?
Well, there were 32 that failed, and they're on the high hardness. The harder the steel, the more susceptible it is if you galvanize it. So that's the issue, the galvanization, the stress, and the environment. Well, they had high stress because they tightened these down. These particular 32 were used to anchor seismic equipment. And the idea is to keep it cinched down so it moves as a unit. So when you have that much high-strength steel, and it's under high stress, and in rainwater or even a marine environment, it's susceptible to attack. And so 32 of the first 96 rods that they put in, and it's only been in since 2008. So in just this time, they tightened them, and then within 2 weeks, they failed dramatically. It was a pretty big jolt for them, literally.
So how unsafe is this bridge that they've been building now for like 30 years since the last earthquake?
Well, the only thing they've been able to say is it's going to be safer than the old bridge. But we'll see how they deal with this problem. But it's mostly, the big concern is that seismically, they think it'll be reliable. But they just don't want these bolts to fail over time, because there's two problems. One, you can get the toxic hydrogen in the short term during manufacturing and galvanizing, or it can slowly be ingested, as you will, into the steel, and then suddenly one day crack without notice.
And Jackson, was there any revelations at this hearing this week? I mean, do we have any better sense of how these decisions got made, why they got made? You know, why was it mishandled? Who's responsible?
I think if you asked Senator Mark DeSaulnier, he was left with more questions than answers at this proceeding. He wanted to know how it was that Caltrans would use. Now, one of the things that we've reported is that this stuff was banned even by Caltrans. They knew that high-strength steel that was galvanized in this particular method should not be used on bridges, and their rule since 2000 precluded their use. Yet in 2002, they deviated, quote-unquote, from their standard that would otherwise preclude this stuff from being used. And the question of who decided that is very much open right now.
So I understand the checking of some of these rods is problematic because there's other construction of road that's gone on above them. What does this do to the projected opening date for the bridge?
Well, it's also up in the air right now. They're talking about, at this hearing, there was a reference to maybe retrofitting the opening day party that the many gatherings they had planned, you know, the preview dates and all that stuff. And right now, we don't even know if it's going to make that date. Right. But I think that they're hoping that they can replace the rods that are vulnerable over a long term. And they're going to bypass the rods that failed and create a giant steel saddle that they'll literally strap this stuff down with high-strength steel cables in lieu of these bolts, the 96 that have failed.
But even if they have it in that situation after they open the bridge, it's still much safer than the bridge I drive on now 3 times a week, right?
That's what they say. You know, even if they don't get all this seismic equipment anchored down just right, or they have to wait to replace the potentially at-risk rods over time, they're basically saying no matter what, when you drive on this bridge, you're safer than the old bridge.
And then really quickly, Jerry Brown's been kind of quiet. He said, I think the other day, last week, stuff happens. You know, not very kind of Zen-like response to it. Should he be more involved in this, do you think? I mean, is there a role for him if he were more engaged on this particular issue?
You know, I think that the technical experts have got to figure out what to do here. I'm not sure the governor could weigh in on that topic.
All right, Jackson, thank you so much.